Welcome to the next episode of the Radio Data Podcast. Today, our expert guest is Jonas Björk, who lives in Sweden and works as the Chief Technology Officer at Acast. Jonas, it's my pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Adam. It's great to be here.
Likewise. And let's start with the introduction. So could you please tell us more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you said, Jonas Björk. I'm currently Chief Technology Officer at Acast. I've been at Acast for about 5 years, or a little over 5 years already. Time flies. Before that, I was at Spotify, working with the host of the show, Adam Kava, for a few years back in the Hadoop era at Spotify. But if we quickly just jump back a bit more in time, I throughout my career mostly been working with data and in the data space. After university, I started my career as many engineers at the time at Ericsson, research, working at the machine learning department over there. So for a few years working with like internal applied research in the machine learning space, looking at different business opportunity in kind of the software offering that Ericsson were working at the time. Mostly working with recommendation systems. This was at the time of the Netflix price, and everyone were building recommendation systems, and it was the hottest thing to work with at the time. And it was super fun, and that's also where I started working a bit broader with just software engineering in general, because it was very applied research. So we had to build proof of concepts of everything we kind of came up with. After that, I left for a smaller company, startup, even though we didn't call ourselves a startup. I guess it was a startup where we were trying to build and offer like business intelligence as a service. So at the time, they had identified that a lot of the big users of business intelligence, they were operating at this really expensive proprietary like TerraCloud and MicroStrategy, enterprise expensive license platforms to kind of get the leverage they needed from that type of products. And there were a lot of open source offerings starting to pop up, both databases and BI tools and whatnot. So they wanted to build a managed BI offering, cloud-based, to offer to the kind of segment of customers that couldn't afford those really expensive enterprise solutions. So that was super fun and interesting, kind of working with the entire stack of both getting the technology up and running and getting all those open source projects to function together in a smooth offering, but also kind of to experience the whole sell cycle and be able to find and get customers on board and constantly generate value for them.
If I remember correctly, this was the time that we met first time, because you gave a presentation at our Stockholm Hadoop user group meetup at Spotify office, I think maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah, something like that. No, it's correct. So we started also looking at exploring the Hadoop ecosystem and everything in that space, and had some stuff that we were working on, and I got in contact with you. We presented at the Hadoop meetup, which you were organizing for many years. It was a amazing meetup. I learned so much stuff in all of those sessions. So thank you for doing that for so many years for the Stockholm community. Which eventually led to me joining Spotify, and most of my time there I worked in the data infrastructure side of things. At the end, I moved over to working with search and the search teams in Stockholm. So that's a little bit background on myself.
And then you decided to join Acast. Could you please tell us more about Acast? What is the company doing? Why you decided to join Acast?
Absolutely. I mean, Spotify was great. I learned so much. I mean, you've been there as well. There were really talented people and a really kind of inspiring environment to be in, and especially in the data landscape. We were dealing with pretty new problems and trying to solve things in uncharted territories. So that was super fun. So what really led me to Acast. So at the time when I joined Acast, the tech department was 15, 17-ish people, and we're just starting kind of take off in terms of scaling organization and technical architecture and everything. And I met up with Jonas Björk, one of the co-founders, and really kind of bought into the vision that was presented, but then also like I was a heavy consumer myself of podcasts. It's a medium I find extremely valuable, especially from a kind of educational point of view. I listen to a lot of, mostly in technology space, and just to learn new stuff and be inspired by interesting people. So I really enjoyed the medium in itself, and the thing that still Acast stands for, kind of represent, is that we have we talk a lot about an open podcasting ecosystem and what does that mean, but I think putting some other words on it, another way to describe it is that it's one of few permissionless publishing and permissionless consumption. And what do I mean by that? It's anyone can start a podcast. Like, you don't need to agree to terms of services of one of these, big proprietary tech giants, and there's no gatekeeping in the podcasting ecosystem. So it becomes very democratic from that point of view. So, and the threshold is pretty low as well. It's pretty easy to get started, which means that any voice can get out there in the world. And the same goes for the consumption side. Like, anyone can pick up and parse these RSS feeds that are out there. Pretty much anyone can build a player if you're not happy with the players that exist. So, like, that balance, it's quite much resembles how internet kind of operates and works in terms of having a permissionless publishing and a permissionless consumption. And that whole idea of enabling that and building the infrastructure and the platform and the future for podcasting in that space got me really excited, inspired. And that's still what gets me out of bed every morning. I find it super interesting to be part of this industry and to drive it forward.
Yes, I totally agree. Let's now talk more about data and analytics in the podcasting industry, especially at Acast. So could you please share us some information about what type of data do you collect and process, and what business use cases you implement on top of such data?
So it's quite interesting from some aspects, making some references here to Spotify, since we both work together on that side of things. I hope the listeners can relate as well to some extent. So in both cases, most businesses, like if you build an e-commerce site or whatever type of business you run online, typically the like financial aspect of your business is a very transactional data set somewhere. Like, there's a credit card swipe, or it's pretty easy to know what is what. But at both Spotify and Acast, it's not that trivial. Like, you need to define and when should we count the listen to be valid, and did we have ads running in that listen or not, and what advertiser did that come from, and all the data pipelines and the computations you need to make just to figure out how much money is who making, and what was referred to as the royalty pipelines at Spotify, and we have we call it the calculation pipelines, like internal Acast. I think that's fairly unique in terms of both volume of data that you need to do that, and running like the core of your business on those volumes of data, pretty much originating from server logs. Like, you're picking up server side logs, and you need to in our case, since we don't own the client, at Spotify, you have more control and can put instrumentation in the client. Since podcasting can be consumed anywhere, we operate only on the server side of things and need to kind of recreate user state and sessions and whatnot on our end to see, did the user or the listener listen to enough of the podcast for it to be counted as a listen? Did it listen to the ad in the beginning? Did it listen to the ad in the middle? And so on and so forth. So that is an interesting challenge in itself. And I mean, if we look at, I mean, it's billions of requests coming in monthly on those ad points where we serve audio files. So there's for sure high volumes of data, and the entire business run on that core data set. So that makes things both challenging and interesting at the same time, I think. You probably remember End Song at Spotify being kind of the core and everything. So our equivalent of that. So the kind of what dictates in podcasting how to count listens and how to count ad impressions. So the International Advertising Bureau, IAB, released a podcasting measurement specification to ensure that all platforms use the same logic when you classify a valid listener or not. So you can compare, statistics across hosting platforms. So you implement those, and then you have an external auditor coming in from IAB, and you walk through the implementation of those metrics together to kind of get certified that you have an accurate, interpretation of that requirement.
You said that in your case it's more difficult because you can only analyze the server logs, and based on those logs and also requests to a third-party services, you can build the business events. Like the user started listening to some podcast, the user listened the first minute of the podcast, or the user listened to the given advertising in the podcast. Is that true?
Correct. Correct. And I mean, we have web-based like embed players where we collect first-party data as well from our own clients. We used to have a mobile app as well, which we discontinued last year. So I mean, there are ways and mechanisms to get like first-party client-side data, and you can use that to build models and train and make sure that your server-side logic is accurate enough for the purposes you're dealing with. But yeah, I mean, given how again the industry functions, you have many podcast hosts, and you have many podcast players or podcatchers, and that entire kind of ecosystem is reliant on that to
yes,
work.
And the use cases that you mentioned are related to finance, advertising, and I believe that many of them are internal use cases, so that your company stakeholders know how the business is doing. There is also necessary information in case of any audits to make sure that the podcasts are counted correctly. And how about any useful information for the podcasters? So personally, I also use Acast to distribute radio data to other podcasting applications like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and I get a lot of interesting insights in your web portal. And can you tell a bit more about them?
Yes, and those metrics are most of them are originating from the same sources, like basically our audio distribution. When we deliver audio to someone listening to the podcast out there, like how much information can we decorate to that listen, and how much insights can we draw from that? So I mean, it's everything from obviously the geographical distribution of your listeners. We can infer all types of interest and demographics and whatnot for different use cases. You can look at listen rate, like for how long do people listen to this episode, when do they drop off? Will they stick around to the end of this podcast episode, or will they drop off earlier? And as a creator, you might be able to kind of try different formats of the episodes and see, does this make the listener stick around longer, or do they drop off, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things we can do with data from those sources, and pushing it up to the creators and help them both understand their audience and the content, how the content creator is performing.
And what are the key metrics or dashboards or maybe data sets that you look very often as the CTO of the company?
I was thinking about that a bit coming in here. What is there something that is a constant thing? And obviously, like general growth metrics, like how many shows are registering with us, and how many shows are publishing, and all of that is data that we're continuously looking at. Obviously financial data as well of how the company is performing in different markets around the world. But otherwise, I think it's more related to like different type of initiatives that we're working in different periods of the company. And we recently released a self-serve ad buying way for advertisers to sign up with Acast and buy ads directly on the website without involving any Acast staff in that journey, and that's pretty exciting because it's a very new type of use case for us. We've typically been dealing with demand, the advertiser from larger buyers, spending big advertising money and bigger campaigns, but we really want to enable any advertisers to reach the podcast audience. So like this year, that's probably the metrics I'm looking at the most, to see what type of advertisers are coming on board and what markets, and how many impressions are we delivering through that demand source, and so on and so forth. So I think it's more related to depending what type of initiatives we're working on in the offering.
I believe that this is combined with the user data, in this case advertisers, plus product analytics, because this data can give you interesting feedback whether the end users like a given feature, or maybe it becomes difficult or easy for them to use the product in a given way.
Correct. And if you look at, when we discontinued the mobile app, which was the kind of the touch point we had to listeners, and listeners are obviously much larger in volumes compared to number of advertisers or number of creators. So like the products we're offering and the stuff you interact with when you're publishing podcasts in Acast. So I think our latest public number was 92,000 shows in our catalog. So that's 92,000 active people interacting with our tools, while we have 430 million listens every month. So it's to your point, it's very different type of data and very different type of use cases, trying to draw conclusions from the listener data coming in versus understanding as a creator, and you want to publish a new episode, like where do we have friction in the product, and where are people getting stuck in terms of going in and editing or using the tools, and so on and so forth. But to some extent, both of those use cases, that's our product. I mean, that's what we do. We distribute audio for the creators, and we help them monetize and make money from the work, and we help them grow their audience. And some touch points are web applications to our customers, and some touch points is just how we distribute audio and see kind of where that distribution is happening around the world.
Yes. And you mentioned that your users are using various tools, and Acast is actually ecosystem of different tools, because there are some companies that Acast has acquired in the past, and one of them makes it possible to use AI to improve the quality of the podcasts. And can you tell a bit more about this, how different AI techniques could be used to improve the audio quality or improve the podcaster or listener experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe first, just a quick background on data at Acast. So when we started working with getting data, 2019, I think.
Yes.
At that time, we had a centralized data team that kind of were managing data pipelines and everything, data infrastructure and systems related. While the rest of the organization were really moving to a decentralized owner structure of, very autonomous teams running their own systems, being on call for their own stuff, and so on and so forth. So quite quickly, as we gained critical mass in data skilled people and data competence, we decentralized all those people we had out to these product teams and wanted to get the kind of data competence closer to the products that we were building and closer to the actual value creation in terms of delivering value to the customers, and not having the other teams kind of relying on a central team to do the data work for them. So in that environment where when you say that we have a diverse set of technologies and data stacks and whatnot, it's also partly an artifact of that, because then we have all these autonomous teams making slightly different choices in terms of what tools they think is the best tool for the use case they are solving for. So we have somewhat of a data stack originating from that space. But then as we started moving everything into AWS, because we used to run stuff in Azure back in the days, and then we moved to on-prem machines running on bare metal, and then we moved into AWS for that whole journey is probably an episode in itself, why we made all those choices. Today we're in AWS, and over the last 2 years, we've been trying to kind of streamline quite a bit in terms of how we operate on that. So just, agreeing that data across teams, we put it in S3, data that's shared across teams is Parquet. We use Athena as kind of a query layer on top of it, and have this kind of cross-account kind of data mesh-ish setup, because the teams produce data in their own data sets, and we have this kind of glue catalog sitting on top of it to make it accessible across this decentralized ownership structure that we have. But then also we acquired companies, and we acquired Podchaser last year. That is very much centered around data and having the knowledge graph of podcasting in the world. So some refer it to the IMDb of podcasting. So if you want to know anything about podcasting or what shows have this guest been on and so on and so forth, that kind of knowledge graph is what Podchaser, among other things, have built up through the years. So they also come in with a different set of technologies and technology stack. And then, moving into your question was mostly around AI, and I think, with the advancements we're seeing in the AI space, that's on top of mind for a lot of people. And there's a lot of use cases and interesting stuff happening in podcasting as well. And I mean, if you just look at creating content, it's pretty easy for anyone right now to generate text, like actual content that is fairly good, right? And it's pretty easy to take that text and produce audio from that text automatically. You can even deep fake it, so it sounds like it's Adam reading that text for you, right? So you can leverage machines to generate somewhat high quality content, right? And there probably are use cases for that somewhere around the corner in the future. But I think the thing with podcasting and like why I enjoy podcasting, and I imagine yourself as well, is that when you listen to these creators, like every week releasing new episodes, and it's you kind of build up a relationship with that creator. And I think it's hard to get that relationship feeling by generating content. I mean, there's something with humans, saying the wrong things and kind of get that human touch into the content that I think makes podcasting sticky. And that makes, you want to get to the next week's episode and you're waiting for Thursday morning because your favorite podcaster is releasing. You put your headphones in and go for a run. And I think that's probably harder to replace with machine-generated content and AI-generated content. But if it's purely about learning, like I want to 30 minutes quickly learn more about this new technology, that's probably doable to just tell an algorithm to generate the 30-minute episode for you on that topic, put it in 1.5 speed on the playback and go for that run.
It's really interesting that machines use technology to sound more like humans, and humans would like to use sometimes technology to behave a bit more like machines, to produce content in much faster way. Since we talk about new advancements in the AI and ML sector, do you see interesting trends in the podcasting industry that might leverage those advancements?
So I think the interesting aspect, coming back to the how the industry is operating with many host providers and many clients out there. A lot of the advancements are, some would claim it's slow, we're based on this old RSS technology, serializing everything to XML. It's inefficient, it's slow, etc., etc. But even if we would move beyond that, it's still. I find it really interesting to drive innovation in an ecosystem where you need to create something that is actually beneficial for the industry as a whole. You can't just run with things that would benefit yourself. If it doesn't benefit the other parties in the industry, it's likely not going to be around because there's no incentive for anyone to pick up on that. So some of the maybe short win innovations that a hosting provider would benefit from or a client would benefit from is somewhat held back because of that, which I don't think is necessarily bad, because I think some of the, I don't know if we would call it problems, but the less good things about internet and how some of the things have kind of evolved is also harder to kind of just organically quick happen in podcasting. I think there's more of a threshold in doing some quick fixes or short wins for individual companies, and you really need to kind of figure out the long-term sustainable innovation for it to actually get adoption. So in data per se, I mean, it's still an unsolved problem in terms of how would you create, incentives for all these parties to exchange and share data to a higher degree. How would that mechanism work? And there's been several attempts. I don't know if you follow that part of the industry, but we had RAD, remote audio data, I think it stands for, that suggested to embed a bunch of metadata in the ID3 tags in the MP3 files. So when the player hit that metadata information when doing playback of the audio, it could act on that, and it could be like callback URLs or whatever to send event data back to whoever is distributing the audio. Similar attempts have been, rather than putting it in the MP3 file, to put that information in the RSS feed itself. So hey, when you hit these markers, please do these callbacks. So you can collect metrics of user behavior and different aspects more easily. But again, like there's a lot of privacy preserving trends, and people are more and more keen to not be monitored of their usage and so on and so forth. And we see more and more regulations prohibiting companies to do that. The death of the cookies is around the corner and so on and so forth. Podcasting hasn't ended up there, again, because of all of this. So podcasting had to kind of innovate around that space instead, and focus much more on the contextual aspect of what are you listening to. And I would argue it's turned out to be much more powerful to kind of operate from that contextual, because you remove a lot of bias in that. Like, you're not profiling individuals of demographic profiles to the same extent and so on and so forth. But if you're listening and interested in this context, and you're this show or this episode, and you can do a lot of analysis of the tone of the content, or the language or semantics, etc., and leverage that instead of attributes of you as an individual. So I think there's a lot of very interesting things to do more of in that space.
Do you assume that there will be only more and more podcasts, because the podcasting industry by itself is growing, because people enjoy consuming podcasts, because you can combine this with other activity, like going to a gym, commuting to the office, cleaning your house, plus the advancements in AI industry helps people to be more productive, generate new content much faster. Maybe there will be some bots generating the podcast episodes as well, as you mentioned in the example. So the conclusion might be that the number of podcasts and episodes might increase dramatically thanks to that.
I do think so. I think like we're very early where podcasting will be in a few years from now. Comparing it to other mediums, it's still very early, which is also very exciting. Like, the industry is growing a lot, but there is something with the power of audio, and there are so many other trends pointing in that direction as well. I mean, how people talk about screen time all the time, and having kids as a parent, you just want the kids to have less screen time, and if they would say, well, I'm just gonna relax and listen to a podcast instead, I would be extremely happy, right? So there's something about audio, and as you said, you combining that with doing other activities. Like, as soon as you're attached to your screen, you can't really do anything else. You have to pay attention to the screen.
Yes, exactly.
So I for sure think it's a medium that's going to grow a lot for many, many years going forward. And I think that technology will probably more evolve the type of content that will be generated. Going back to some type of content is well, again, like if rather than start Googling for something you will learn about, like if you just could tell ChatGPT to, hey, I got a 25-minute run ahead of me. Give me an episode about this, and you can just start listening to that. I mean, that's not far out to actually be a thing. But again, I don't think it would be this, building this relationship with the creators and this kind of fan base that to me is what's very interesting about podcasting itself.
And what can also help to build the relationship with the audience is speaking in their native language. Because right now we speak in English. You speak English perfectly, but for both of us, English is not our native language. You come from Sweden, I come from Poland. But what I also think might increase the adoption of the podcast is using AI to translate the content from the local language of the podcaster, because someone can be very fluent and very nicely speaking in own native language, and AI can translate that to other language, for instance, English. Do you see a large number of podcasts recorded in local languages or at least non-English speaking podcasts? Not only Swedish, Polish, but maybe French, Spanish?
Yes, I mean, podcasting is growing in all markets. We don't have a strong presence in Asian languages right now. Spanish obviously is really big, and we have a lot of podcasters both in France and Germany as well. So we're operating in 12 markets, so we have a lot of different languages. I think like automatic translation, and I guess we're talking about some type of deep fake again, like Adam is already sudden, doing his podcast in fluent French, right? That would be pretty cool, and again, probably doable. I mean, it is doable probably as we speak right now, but it might be a bit, not weird, but I don't think you would have as a good flow in that generated French podcast. And I think it's different type of use cases. Like as a creator, if to some creators, what they're creating is important, and I think a lot of that feeling might get lost in all those steps in terms of translation. So it depends, I think, what type of content. But there are other use cases, like as parts of the podcast could be localized, right? You could do the introduction in different languages and translate that, and then you move to the core in the native language of the host, because that's kind of where the creativity kind of might be a part of you speaking Polish, because that's how you are able to express yourself the best in that space. And the same thing for advertisers. Like it's probably a lot easier to reach very localized commercial messages if you can on the fly translate and produce a commercial message in the listener's language where they are, regardless of where they're located in the world. So I think, again, lots and lots of potential and use cases where that will be applicable.
Yes, so there are some challenges to make it very smooth and build this relationship with the audience, but hopefully this might be possible to some extent, at least, to help some podcasters to reach the wider audience. Because if you have a podcaster who will need to learn new language to reach a bigger market, it might be tricky, but maybe AI and ML will make it easier and possible. And you briefly mentioned the technology stack that you use at Acast. And can you tell more about the technologies that you use to implement data and analytics pipelines and use cases at your company?
Currently, as I mentioned, everything runs in AWS, and we, as a whole, not just in the data space, we try to. We have one of our engineering principles is to minimize time spent on maintenance. So we prefer picking something that is, more managed or serverless in AWS ecosystem to reduce the cost of maintaining that ourselves. So again, like S3 Parquet Athena is the data lake, data mesh is kind of a layer that we have to share data across all the product teams. Within those teams, if it's more larger volumes of data, most of those pipelines are written in Spark, running on EMR. Most teams are using managed Airflow for orchestration. They run one instance per team. We don't have a kind of shared infrastructure for that, so we try to make that autonomously owned in each team as well. But we're also, like, again, depending on what type of use case, some of the stuff we just process in containers in ECS. We have Lambdas, we have glue pipelines. So just trying to leverage what's available in AWS to get the use case done more or less. Then for our kind of more low latency dashboarding stack, we currently use Snowflake. So we have a bunch of pipelines transforming data from S3, loading it into Snowflake, and we have Looker on top of that for more self-serve dashboarding. And yeah, I mean, that's high level the stack we're working with, mostly Python in data pipelines. In the rest of the stack, it's we're more or less a JavaScript or TypeScript company these days. For the high performing parts, we have moved to Rust the last years, which I think, I don't know what your view, if talked to a friend of mine this week about that, if I ended up in a filter bubble online, but it feels like Rust is starting to gain some traction in the data ecosystem as well, more and more the last year or so.
Yes. I also see the increased adoption of Rust and the fact that more and more engineers use it also in data and machine learning projects. And for example, even this month, at the end of March, we organized the Big Data Tech Warsaw conference, and we'll have there a presentation that will explain how you can use Rust libraries to lower infrastructure costs and speed up MLOps in several areas such as data processing, feature store, feature serving, and also model serving and things like that.
Yeah, and I think I know you often come back to with your guest around like open source projects and whatnot that's being used. So in between Azure and AWS, we had, and this was around the time when I joined Acast, there was this ambition to be cloud agnostic and try to make more of those choices, like what can we run regardless of cloud provider. But I think we quite rapidly ended up kind of concluding that it was too costly for us to try to maintain that, and decided to be okay with choosing again, like more managed services in AWS and deal with the potential vendor lock-in we get as a side effect of that. So that said, like we're still, wherever possible, we try to leverage open source software, but we don't have a strategy any longer to kind of optimize for those type of use cases. We're rather trying to pick things that makes our lives easier and quicker to iterate on the product value and delivering things.
And do you have any plans for 2023 that might change the technology stack that you are using? For instance, do you have any interesting technologies on your radar?
We do. I think as for most tech companies, the last 9 months have been interesting to say the least, and we as most companies as well have pivoted away from a hyper growth strategy into hitting profitability sooner than the original business plan we had. So this year is very much more focused on finding efficiencies and I think more looking at converging some technology choices and identifying like here we have two very similar things, and the cost of trying to keep this up and running isn't really outweighing the benefits of it, and consolidating some both choices in the stack and some systems and pipelines and whatnot. So I think the investments that are being made this year, rather than introducing a lot of new things in that space, it's much more about finding more efficiency and kind of setting the foundation to get out of this macroeconomic situation on a high growth curve again, and have a really lean and kind of slick foundation to operate on.
Yeah, but still, I hope that the costs that you pay for the cloud will grow, because you will have more and more podcasters and more users. So you will have more server logs to store and analyze.
Absolutely, but I think again, I don't know if I would call it a trend, but I see more and more companies kind of questioning some of their cloud spend, and if it's reasonable to move the high load things to auto cloud again and start operating on a more hybrid approach. I mean, cloud is great when you're using what you're paying for, but I think a lot of companies, including ourselves, like some of the use cases we have, it's just costing more because we're paying for all these extras that we're not really leveraging and don't really need. So I think that's probably, and especially with the macro economic environment that companies and tech companies are in right now, to kind of revisit some of their cloud vendors. And I think if you look in the big data space, obviously there's quite a big cloud invoice every month related to data. So I think that's probably something that we'll see more and more of.
Yes, that's true. We can joke that a CFO becomes important part of each data team, and CFO can add interesting requirements to the implementation of your data projects and data architecture.
Indeed. The financial aspect is always obviously important, but I think even more so these days, to really understand how money is spent and what value you're creating with it.
Yes, and we have still a few minutes left, so I would like to ask the final question about the most challenging aspects of the data-specific projects in the podcasting industry. So could you tell us more about the challenges that you need to face when working on data and analytics in your industry?
I coming back to what we mentioned earlier, I think it is, and it obviously it's a challenge, but I think it's part of the design of the podcasting industry, which is both good and bad. But the fact that big advancements in terms of what data we are collecting and sharing and whatnot in the industry needs to be kind of agreed upon and adopted, and it's not just one single player that will be able to decide that, and I think that is a challenge, but it's also I would argue a good thing in podcasting. Again, we're preventing any one of the big tech to just come in and set the rules and start quite privacy intrusive, follow everyone across the entire web. That's not possible in podcasting right now, and personally I don't think that's a good model to operate either, and we see that regulations are starting to come in. And the good thing for Acast and podcasting is we don't have to change away from that. Like the online business have to pivot away from that. We're not in that position. Like we have a sustainable business without that. So I think podcasting is probably at the position where we can innovate even further in that space. And from a data point of view, I think that is a super interesting aspect of the podcasting industry.
When you were responding to that question, I was also thinking about the fact that you provide the open platform for podcasters so that everyone can join and distribute the podcast to other podcasting apps, as many as he or she wants. However, there is also some competition for the content in the podcasting industry, and some companies have exclusive content that is available only on their platforms, so that this can drive the traffic to their platform and increase the number of users. And do you see that this trend to continue, or more and more podcasters will choose to use the open platform like Acast?
I think the open platforms like Acast is the winner in the long run here. That said, there's always going to be creators who, for whatever reasons, is better suited to be exclusive on certain platforms. I mean, it could be, again, why is Acast here? We're here to help podcasters make money and grow their audience, and some type of content, they might make more money and grow their audience better in a closed ecosystem somewhere else. But I think for the vast majority of content creators operating in an open ecosystem where your content can be consumed anywhere is going to be beneficial in both those aspects to help the podcaster make more money and grow their audience. They're going to have a much wider reach operating like that. And as you know, being hosted with Acast, your show can be consumed anywhere. It can be consumed in Apple's podcast player, in Spotify, in whatever listening destination we have, because we distribute that content everywhere. So I'm really convinced that the open model of podcasting is the long-term winner in this.
I will open the Acast UI to check how many platforms I'm using to distribute our show.
So the ones you see in our tool are the ones where like some of the bigger platforms, we have some more kind of agreement with of how we integrate and push the content. But given how podcasting works, I mean, it's similar to hosting an HTML page on a web hosting somewhere. You don't necessarily know everyone fetching that HTML page, and the same thing with RSS. Like, well, we see that someone is fetching it, but there are probably thousands of platforms where your podcast can be consumed that's not listed in that.
Yes, that's true.
Exactly. Yeah. So those are more the major ones where we have tighter relationships with and integrations with.
Yes, I'm checking that we use Spotify, Samsung Podcast, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, of course, YouTube. But what is also interesting is the fact that you don't have to use the podcasting application. You can also listen directly through the website. But this might be less convenient, but still it's possible.
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of people consuming podcasts in the web browser as well. Maybe they're at work or at home, or it's the easiest way. You search for a podcast and you get a Google result linking into a player somewhere where you can just start listening to it. So it's a really easily accessible format to get a hold of. Think of another data challenge, which isn't really data per se, but it's interesting that there's no kind of canonical truth of what like a identifier of a show in podcasting, which is an interesting challenge for anyone operating in this industry as well. So it's pretty easy. Like, I could take your S feed and replicate your show on pretty much every hosting provider. So then your show would exist in like 20 replicas. And from an outside, it's really hard to know which hosting provider are you currently publishing to. So like what is the canonical truth of your show right now? So that's something that all platforms have to solve for themselves, because there is no kind of central registry where you can tell the world that I know my podcast exists in 20 places, but this one is the real one.
Yes. So it's really interesting.
So like online, that's to some extent solved. Like, you have DNS lookups, and you register your domain, and you can route traffic, and you kind of somehow know what is what. But that's that kind of global registry of what shows exist and how do we identify this specific show. And you might change platform as well. You might leave Acast and go to another hosting platform, and 2 months later you go to another platform. And then, depending on when in time, you have different hosting providers and you have different show URLs. So, but there's no identifier that is kind of consistent with your show as you progress throughout the years.
Yes.
But if you're building a podcast app, you need to know that, because you need to be able to make sure that the listeners are subscribing to your show and not someone else's replicated show.
Yes, definitely. So it introduces a lot of complexity and makes it more difficult to implement some useful use cases on top of that later.
Exactly. And this is also coming back to the, Podchaser's knowledge graph of podcasting, having, built that ecosystem and solved for a lot of those use cases. So what is what and who is who in this space, which is super interesting in how that can drive the entire industry forward in so many use cases.
Absolutely. Yes, so this concludes our podcast episode. Jonas, I would like to thank you for our conversation and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Adam. This was super fun.